Hi, my name is Martin Berhiniak. Welcome back to Digital Art for Beginners series here on PSD Touch Plus. Today we are going to continue talking about how to shade objects to make them look 3D. And as I said in the last episode, where we were talking about planar geoforms, like the box, now we need to learn more about round geoforms, like the cylinder, cone, and sphere. We are going to use the terms that we've learned in the previous episode, so I'm going to refer to that one. If you want to continue and follow along, I highly recommend to watch the previous episode. So it's in the same series. You can easily find it under the session page, just like all the other previous episodes. But to start this episode with, I'm going to draw a cylinder. I'm going to create a new document, so I go to File, New, or press Command N, and I'm going to create a new document. The size doesn't matter, but then what is important is to go to the 3D options and choose New Shape from Layer and choose Cylinder. Now this option is only available in the extended version of Photoshop and also only in CS4 and CS5. If you don't have these versions, then you can just simply draw a cylinder based on the things that we've learned in the perspective episode. I just find this a quicker way to quickly create a form, and actually it's already shaded, so we even have a shading on it. I'm using the 3D rotate tool just to turn this cylinder around a bit. Something like this would be okay for us, and I'm making it a bit smaller, and then I can rasterize this object. So I'm going to right click on it and choose rasterize 3D. So that was a fast way to create a 3D object just for the sake of this exercise. But we already know if we have a vanishing point or several vanishing points, we know how to draw a cylinder based on the perspective. And by the way, in the previous tutorial, I used the same technique to create a box, again using 3D New Shape from Layer cube. Now that we have this cylinder, I'm going to create another layer in the background, and I'm going to fill it with black. And I'm going to create another layer. I make a selection, and this is going to be my foreground. I'm going to fill that with 90% brightness here in Photoshop. So this is going to be a bright plane. Now to get rid of the shading that we already have on this object, on the cylinder, I'm going to just simply divide the object into two parts first of all. So I'm going to use my magic wand tool, and I click here on the top part or top piece, and then I go to layer, new layer via cut, which is Command Shift J in the default keyboard shortcuts in Photoshop. So now I have it on a separate layer, so we can call this top and side. And if I lock the transparency for both of them, then I can easily change their color values. I'm going to use for the top the same color that we have for the ground plane. So I just pressed Command Backspace to fill it in with that color. And for the side, I'm going to use a little bit darker value. So in my foreground color, I'm going to select 70%, and I fill that in with 70%. We can create first the cast shadow, and then we can focus on the object itself, the shading of the object itself. Using what we've learned in the previous tutorials, we can quickly construct the shadow. But now I would like to be quick, so I'm not going to construct them properly. I just want to make it quickly. So let's say my light source is again here somewhere on the left, somewhere here on the top left. And the light source is the sun, so the light won't radiate. All lines from the light source will be parallel. So let's say the light source is somewhere from here. Then when it will hit the edge of the cylinder, it will follow this line, and I'm going to copy this line on the other side as well. So as you can see, they are parallel to each other. Now all I need is another 2 lines coming from the object itself, and I can play with the placement of the light source. I can change the angle, or I can make it completely straight if it's a side lighting, and then I make just a guess on the other edge of the ellipse, and I try to draw a parallel line to this one here on the bottom, and these 2 lines defined the edges of the shadow. Now I just need to connect them, and for that I'm going to use the pen tool. Just like in the previous examples, I'm using a fill shape with the pen tool, and I'm connecting these lines. Here, if I zoom closer, you will see what I'm doing. I'm defining a curve, click, and defining this curve onto that line. If you don't know how to work with the pen tool, I recommend to go to the basics session here on PSD Touch Plus, and there is a lesson about working with the pen tool. Now I have the shadow, I put this below the object itself, and I hide all these construction lines so I can delete them. I'm going to repeat what we've learned in the previous tutorial to create a more realistic shadow. I'm going to first turn it into a smart object, so right click on the layer, choose convert to smart object, then go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, use a blur on it. In this case I'm just going to use a slide blur, something like 6 or 7. Then select the mask, the filter mask, use a black and white linear gradient like this, and then I command click on the mask and make sure that the object is selected now, and then I click on create a mask. The mask is created. I just need to invert it pressing command I. Once again, I used exactly the same technique in the previous episode, so this is just an exercise repeating the same steps. So if you want to learn this technique, just go back to the previous episode. So now we have a nice shadow, and we can play a bit with the density as well, just to see the edge of the shadow as well. So we have quite realistic shadow here on the bottom. Obviously the opacity is too much, so I'm going to turn down the opacity of the shadow a bit, something like this. And all I need now on this object is to define the shadows on the object itself. The basic rule with round objects is that you have on the object itself, on the round shape, a core shadow. So we have the cast shadow on the plane. This is the cast shadow, but we also have a core shadow, which is the darkest part of the object itself, and this core shadow always lines up with the cast shadow. You will see in a minute what I mean. In the previous episode, we used the burn and the dodge tool to brighten and darken the sides of the object. I'm going to show you now another way to do it. This is more non-destructive way to do changes, value changes on the sides of an object. I'm going to create a new layer, and I alt click between this new layer and the side layers. That will create a clipping mask. Again, if you don't know about clipping masks, visit the basics tutorial series. So that's a clipping mask, and I'm going to draw with my brush tool on this layer, but it will make sure that I have the original side layer untouched. So whenever I want to make changes, I can always make changes on this separate layer, and the side layer is only to capture the form and to keep the base color separately. So that's a really useful thing. It's a non-destructive way to add and remove values. So I'm going to use the brush tool, and I make my brush larger, and I make it softer. It's Control Alt and click, or right click on the PC, and then just drag around up and down to change the hardness, and right and left to change the size of your brush. It's only in CS5 and CS4, this feature. So I'm going to use the numbers on my keyboard, and I'm going to change the opacity of my brush to 5%. I press 0, 5, one after each other. That changes the opacity quickly to 5%. And I turn off pressure sensitivity. In this case, I don't need it. And I'm going to start drawing on the image. I'm going to start drawing here in the middle. I go through it a couple of times. Then I make my brush smaller, and I continue doing the same thing. And I also hold down Shift to be able to draw vertical line. I made my brush again smaller. And as you can see, I repeat this several times. But what I would like to achieve is to have the darkest value here lined up with my cast shadow, and that is the core shadow on the object. So that is the darkest value. If the light source is somewhere here on the left, then the core shadow will be here in the middle. So that's the darkest value on the object itself, but make sure that it's not darker than the cast shadow itself. So probably I need to knock it back down and change the opacity of this separate layer, but that's why it's a separate layer. It's not on the side. It's a separate layer used only for the shading. So I can reduce the opacity of that, and even though it's not that strong, we still see that it's there in the middle. Now probably because the light is from the left, this side on the right should be also a bit darker than on the left, but it's definitely brighter than the core shadow. Something like this. Remember, we also have reflected light. For that I'm going to change my colors. I press X to switch to white. I still keep it in opacity 5%, and I'm going to draw with white here on the bottom. That is my reflected light, and maybe I can make my shadow a bit darker. I increase the opacity of the shadow just to have a good read between the side of the cylinder and the shadow. Now that was a quick render for a cylinder, but we can do the same thing with a cone. But instead of going through all the steps, I would like to just show you the difference that you need to remember. So let me just create a new document, go to 3D, new shape from layer, and just select cone, which is the first option. There's the cone, and selecting the 3D tools, I can use the 3D object scale tool and click here on Z, here on the top, and drag it to the right to extend it into or onto the Z axis. And I right click on the object and rasterize it. Then I'm going to copy this onto the other object, the cylinder, and I just turn off the layers that I used for the cylinder. So there's my cone, and I will probably make it darker just to pop out from the background. I lock the transparency for this layer, and I select the color somewhere, a gray value somewhere there. I press Alt backspace. So we have our cone, which is an interesting object. We only see one side of it, but this side is all rounded. And the main difference that you need to know about the cone is that you will get two core shadows, probably not visible most of the time, but you need to know about there are two core shadows. So let's say if my shadow is like this, or try to draw tangent lines to my cone shape with the pen tool, that is my shadow, and I just fill that shape with black. So that's the shadow. So what you need to know about the cone is that just like with the cylinder, you will have the core shadows lined up with the cast shadow. So if I want to draw values on this side of the cone. Again, I'm using a separate layer, and I'm going to use 5% and black brush. I will need to have 2 core shadows. So for that, I'm going to draw not just one line leading up to the top, but 2 lines. And these 2 lines have to follow the intersection of the cast shadow and the object. Now this is quite difficult to follow these lines. That's why I'm going to use the rotate view tool, which is here under the hand tool, rotate view tool. And I click and drag to rotate the whole image. And this is easier for my hand to follow this line if I line it up like that. So now it's much easier to follow this line. I'm going to draw several lines, just like with the cylinder. So using this 5% brush, I'm building the core shadow up. Then I'm using the rotate view tool again and rotate the image like this. Switching back to the brush tool. And I'm creating my second core shadow. If I press escape, I will quickly jump back to the normal view. I can always draw over it again and fade it out, or I can also use a filter because this is a separate layer. Again, that's why it's good to have the shading on a separate layer. I can go to filter, blur, and choose Gaussian blur to blur it out, my drawing. Okay, so you can blur it out or reduce the opacity. Several ways to doing this, but I think I also need to draw a shadow between the 2 because that is the side in shadow. We just need to make sure that the core shadows are the darkest parts, but obviously between the 2 core shadows we have to have a solid shadow part. Something like this. Now obviously the shadow, the cast shadow, shouldn't be 100%. And I'm going to increase the contrast by using a white brush on the shading layer. And I'm going to draw over this side of the cone and the other side, and maybe on the top a bit. Like that. Just to emphasize and increase the contrast. And we have obviously reflected light as well, which affects this bottom part, and I can make that a bit more obvious that here on the bottom we have reflected light as well. So remember, I just draw these lines for you. Remember, these are, in this case, the core shadows on the image, and the shadow will be always tangent. It's more like this if I draw it properly with the construction lines. So the shadow will be always tangent to the bottom of the cone. Remember, core shadow and the cast shadow starts from the same point here on the bottom. Now last but not least, I would like to show you how to construct or how to shade a sphere. I already have the example, the final example here, but I would like to do it again. I don't want to do the shadow because you already know how to construct the shadow. With the sphere it's really simple. You just need to decide the angle of the light and then just use an elliptical marquee tool and just follow the same steps what we did in previous examples with the cast shadow. And as you can see on the object itself, we will have the core shadow wrapping around the object exactly where the light hits the object. So in this case, for example, I'll just show you that line quickly. There's my shadow and it hits the object there. So the core shadow will start from there. It's like a ring which goes around the object. And on the other side, yeah, you can tell that my shadow is not good. If it's not a local light, but it's the sunlight, then the shadow should be here on the other side completely parallel. So I'm just going to use my free transform tool, and I'm making my shadow bigger. Yeah. So that's a good way to always make sure that what you are doing is correct. So now it's following the light source, and these 2 points, so let me just use another layer. I show you these 2 points. So there is one point here, and there is the other point there. If I would draw an ellipse between these points, these 2 points, there's my ellipse, and there's the main axis of the ellipse. So following this ring here, I will need to have the core shadow, and the closest point to the light source I will have the hotspot. Now let me fill in this shape with a basic color, something like this. Maybe keep those 2 points just to help me remember the core shadow. I don't really need that line. I will imagine that core shadow line, and I'm going to create a new layer and clip it onto the other layer. I select the black color, 5% opacity, big soft edge brush, and I start with the core shadow area. That's the most important part. So I'm following this form, and I'm making my brush smaller and smaller every time. Then I go back, I make it even bigger, and I keep imagining that the light is coming from that side. So that's what I need to follow, this imaginary ring around the sphere. And remember, we have reflected light from the bottom, but still it should be darker than on the top. So the reflected light shouldn't be stronger than the light on the top, definitely not stronger than the hotspot. So I'm backing up this, I'm blocking it with black, but it won't be darker definitely than the shadow or the core shadow. So this bottom part is brighter than the core shadow area, and definitely brighter than the shadow area, the cast shadow area. And as you can see, it's already start to look like a sphere. I might switch to white, and I start to define more contrast by adding a brighter area here on the top. I can even increase the opacity now to 20% just to make it faster. And if I want to, I can even add 50% and just quickly define that hotspot. If I want to make this object look shiny, I'm going to change the opacity of the shadow because now it's too dark. So I keep it darker than the object itself, but not too dark, something like this. And you don't really need this shiny hotspot if you're working with a matte surface. That's more like a reflecting surface if you have that hotspot. It's more important to define the core shadow and definitely the cast shadow. And this is all that I wanted to cover in this episode. So last time we were talking about the box, and this time we started with the cylinder, then we went on to the cone and finished with the sphere, which is probably the most complicated round geoform to render. Now that we covered these basic forms, in the next tutorial we are going to wrap up all what we've learned about perspective and shading, and we are going to create an abstract form and we are going to shade it. So we are going to use perspective to construct an object, and then use what we learned about lighting and creating shadows to emphasize the form and depth in space. I hope you found this tutorial useful, and I hope it wasn't boring for you. This is again a typical art class topic, but completely everything done in Photoshop. And of course, as always, I try to simplify all these theories to help you learn these principles as easily as possible. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for your attention and see you next time.